Week 15 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few tight ends I'd look to get on the wire this week. Not a heavy week of big pickups, but here's a few guys that had good games, and you could possibly add them that can help your team here. For a couple guys that can help you for this playoff run right now. The first tight end I'd look to get this week's Brevin Jordan of the Houston Texans. I've mentioned on and off this season here, Jordan as a potential tight end to get for your roster. So the last few weeks for him, week 12 versus the Jets, 3 catches, 23 yards, a touchdown. Week 13 versus Indianapolis, 1 catch, 7 yards. And week 14 versus Seattle, another good ball game for him, 4 catches, 26 yards, and a touchdown on 7 targets. So right here, we know he's going to be the tight end over there. We know it's a youth movement over there in Houston, and we know they're not going anywhere. So right here, Tyrod Taylor's not going to be the starter anymore. David Mills and Brevin Jordan have had a decent rapport. And week 15, he's got a good matchup on paper at the Jacksonville Jaguars. So obviously, he really can't stop anyone. And they do give up the 13th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So Jordan right now is available in 100% of fantasy leagues. And if you're very desperate for a tight end, I would give him an ad this week. The next tight end is Gerald Everett of the Seattle Seahawks. Everett, it seems like each and every other week, he has a good fantasy day. So Everett, the last few weeks for him, week 11 versus Arizona, 3 catches, 37 yards. Week 12 at Washington, 5 catches, 37 yards, a touchdown. Week 13 versus San Francisco, 4 catches, 7 yards, 2 fumble losses. And then week 14 at Houston, a catch for 13 yards, 2 catches, 15 yards, and a touchdown. So the Seattle Seahawks tight end here, Gerald Everett, has a matchup in week 15 at his former team, the Los Angeles Rams, that are pretty vulnerable to tight ends. They give up the 14th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So Everett right now is available in 69% of fantasy leagues. And I don't know what to expect out of him. Like I mentioned, 1 week a good game, the next week he does nothing. So right here, maybe versus former team in week 15, he has a pretty good ball game. But right now, if you're bad at the tight end position, he's worth a shot here as a gamble, is Gerald Everett. Because it wouldn't surprise me if he does find the end zone in this one versus former team in week 15. The next tight end is Austin Hooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Austin Hooper, he's definitely a tight end I can't trust. But like I mentioned, he's a guy who had a good ball game in week 14 versus Baltimore. 5 catches, 30 yards, and a touchdown. But besides that, he really hasn't been doing much, is Austin Hooper. Week 11 versus Detroit in that one, 4 catches, 53 yards. Week 12 at Baltimore, 3 targets for the goose egg. And then week 14 versus Baltimore, 5 catches, 30 yards, and the touchdown. So right here, week 15, he does have a good matchup on paper in a Saturday ball game versus the Vegas Raiders that give up the second most fantasy points to tight end. So Hooper out there, he's available right now in 59% of fantasy leagues. So if you're very desperate and you could maybe expect 5 to 6 points and live with that in a playoff matchup with Hooper, then you go out there and get him. But if you want a guy who could go out there and put up big points, you're probably better off keeping the tight end you most likely have on your roster, because Hooper is very Jekyll and Hyde this season, and you really can't trust anyone on that Cleveland Brown offense besides probably Nick Chubb this season. The next tight end I look to get on the wire this week, C.J. Uzomah of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Uzomah, another guy who had a few big weeks this season and then a few weeks where he disappeared and did nothing for fantasy owners. So right now, Uzomah available in 86% of fantasy leagues. The last few weeks for him, week 12 versus the Steelers, 3 catches, 9 yards. Week 13 versus the Chargers in that one, 3 catches, 20 yards. And then week 14 versus San Francisco, 4 catches, 56 yards. I know he's got a tough matchup in week 15 at Denver that gives up the 5th least amount of fantasy points to tight ends on the season. But like I mentioned, tight ends a big crapshoot this season. This week there's not many great options on the wire. And there's a few guys who have pretty decent games like C.J. Uzomah. So right here, if you got a guy who's injured or a guy who you just want to get off your roster and add a tight end, I don't think Uzomah is the worst option in the world, because this Bengal team does throw the football a lot, even though I know it's pretty much Jamar Chase and a little bit of T. Higgins, a bust for that offense, as guys having big days for fantasy owners. But Uzomah is a guy I would give a shot at if you're desperate. In the 5th and final tight end I look to get on the wire this week's Nick Vannett of the New Orleans Saints. And Nick Vannett, I've mentioned him 3 weeks in a row now as an option. And believe it or not, he's been pretty steady for PPR leagues here over the last few weeks. Week 12 versus Buffalo, 1 catch, 11 yards, a touchdown. Week 13 versus Dallas, 3 catches, 48 yards. And week 14 at the Jets, 3 catches, 44 yards. So right here, he's been putting up at least 7 or more fantasy points over the last few weeks here. Nick Vannett's got a good matchup on paper in Week 15 at Tampa that give up the ninth most fantasy points to tight ends. So right here, we know the Saints are most likely going to be trailing early and often in this game versus Tampa Bay in Week 15, and they're going to have to throw the football a ton in this one. And Nick Vannett's been a decent target for Taysom Hill so far in the first few weeks here, with Trautman out for a while, Jawan Johnson not really doing anything. So right here, Nick Vannett's available in 100% of fantasy leagues. And he's at least a guy who's had a little bit of a track record over the last few weeks, putting up some numbers. So that's a few tight ends I look to get here on the waiver wire for Week 15 of the fantasy football season.